Joining us for this afternoon's presentation. I want to say on behalf of African American Studies, our thoughts and prayers go out to the family of Jelani Day. It's unfortunate that this lecture conflicts with today's march, but we appreciate you and your time. And if you must leave early, that is more than understandable and appropriate. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Byron Craig. Dr. Craig is an assistant professor of communication. He earned his Master's of Arts in Queerness and Race and his PhD in Race and Rhetoric from Indiana University, Bloomington. Dr. Craig is also the fourth recipient of the African American Studies Program Summer Faculty Research Initiative. Any tenure track faculty who is engaged in research on African American subjects is eligible for this competitive grant. African American Studies is proud to support the great work of our colleagues across the university. Dr. Craig's talk today, Can America Be Redeemed? Look up at America's Past through the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which is derived from research he completed with the assistance of the African American Studies Research Grant, is a shining example of the high quality research produced by ISU faculty. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Craig.
Thank you, sir. Thanks everyone for coming, and I certainly appreciate the grant. Sadly, I wasn't able to, one of the things that I'm doing with this work is traveling around and looking at sites of memory or memorials to really think about this notion of justice, and specifically restorative justice, as we start thinking about our past and where we are now. So it's still work in progress, most certainly, and hopefully it becomes part of a larger project that I'm working on with my partner and my writing partner on Democracy's Demons. This is just a beginning stage, I think, of more work to come, I hope. So at the end of this, I look forward to your comments and questions and suggestions to help me with this. So I'm going to try to be succinct here so we can have some time. Well, kind of succinct. So I'll start. In September of 1919, two men, Miles Pfeiffer and Robert Croxey, were lynched for allegedly sexually assaulting two white women in Montgomery, Alabama. Racial terror lynching had been the chosen punishment for those accused of any infraction, specifically when it came to protecting the sanctity and purity of white womanhood. For their safety, both men were being transferred to a safer location in Wetumpka, Alabama. Unfortunately, as was the case with racial violence, while being transferred to another prison, a mob attacked the caravan, and Pfeiffer and Croxey were dragged out of the transport by about 25 men, taken to a nearby wooded area, released to run, and subsequently gunned down. One died immediately, the other lived for a few hours, dying later that same day. Days later at 2 a.m. on September 30th, 1919, John Temple, in a separate, unrelated incident, was lynched in a hospital after allegedly wounding a police officer. More would follow. That same summer in Alabama, James E. Lewis, Jim McMillan, Archie Robinson, and an unnamed man were also lynched. These lynchings were one of several incidents of civil unrest that we now know as the American Red Summer of 1919. During the Red Summer, attacks on Black communities and white violence spread to more than 36 cities and counties, where in most states, white mobs attacked mostly African-American communities and neighborhoods. Most of the deaths occurred in rural areas during events like the Elaine race riot in Arkansas, where it is estimated at least 100 to 240 Black folk were killed. But lynching has a much longer history in this country, before and after America's Red Summer of 1919. In Alabama alone, according to the Equal Justice Initiative reporting, there were at least 4,084 racial terror lynchings in 12 southern states between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and 1950, which is at least 800 more lynchings in these states than previously reported. And also from the EJI, there have been documented more than 300 racial terror lynchings in other states during this time period as well. Lynching has at least 6 features, according to EJI. It resulted from a wildly distorted fear of interracial sex, was a response to casual social transgressions. It's based on allegations of serious violent crime. It turns into a public spectacle, often It's escalated into it often escalated into large-scale violence targeting the African-American community. And finally, lynchings of sharecroppers, ministers, and community leaders who resisted mistreatment were most common between 1915 and 1940. In May of 2018, I went to Montgomery, Alabama for the first time since I'd moved away from Atlanta and since my grandparents had died, who lived in Troy, Alabama, not far from Montgomery. I wanted to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice that had opened 1 month earlier. I knew I wanted to do research on memorials that reflected the horrors of being Black in America. Once I arrived, I wanted to be able to walk the streets of Montgomery to feel in some way the way that must have felt in the 1920s. So as I reached the grass knoll of the memorial, those early forms of incarceration in Alabama, along with the insidious nature of lynching Black men, women, and children, it really weighed heavy on my soul. I almost wanted to stop and go no further on my journey. After all, trying to recall someone else's past can be stifling and leave one really still in space and time. When it's not your memory, how can you recover from or ever forget and move beyond the violent history of racism? So memory, as Sturkin reminds us, gives meaning to the present as each moment is constituted by the past. Memory provides the very core of identity. Yet I argue while memory provides us with our identity, sometimes it is the memory of our ancestors that are an important part of making our identity, and that making our identity and that as well has the potential to do the work of naming and recovering citizenship. While memory has the power to move us forward, to move us towards something like healing or justice, we must do more than simply pay reverence to remembering. I would argue we should map out where we have been, or what Caitlin Murphy calls memory mapping. Remembering the past, any past, comes with some painful work, and the consequences for us can be torturous. Still, memory can serve a greater purpose. It can, if we make it a rhetorical practice, offer strategies that move us toward productive acts of restorative justice. Wilderson suggests in his critique of the film 12 Years a Slave that when describing a pivotal scene between the characters Eliza and Solomon, in which she asks him, does he not mourn for the loss of his children after he is captured into slavery, that the loss that accrues to him has no conceptual framework through which restoration of what was lost could be imagined or reimagined. Wilderson's argument brings us to the gist of our problem. Can what is lost be imagined? If not, is restoration of any sort possible? Hence, I ask in this talk, when and where can and is it possible to locate restorative justice through the rhetorical act of memory, remembering, and memorialization of social death or lynching? Memory mapping, as Caitlin Murphy argues, sorry about that, I had a little technical difficulty. Caitlin Murphy argues, is the aesthetic process of representing the affective sensorial, polyvocal, and temporarily layered relationship between past and present, anchored within the specificities of place. Memory mapping works to develop affective visual maps of the relations between bodies, memories, lived experiences, and mnemonic potency of physical objects in space. In doing so, memory mapping projects produce new temporal and spatial arrangements of knowledge and memory in the present that function as a counter practice to the official narratives that often neglect or designate as transgressive certain memories or experiences. Memory mapping requires, as pointed out by Murphy, locating artifacts that directly or indirectly have a relationship with our bodies spatially and or temporally. Acts of Black violence, of anti-Black violence, continue to saturate the fabric of America. Actual and symbolic acts of violence against Black bodies continue even during a pandemic as we continue to deal with the aftermaths and wait for justice. As in the cases of Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others, it is the state that is responsible for the deaths of Black Americans. So we wait for the state to enact some form of justice. Others like Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, and Jordan Davis were murdered by white vigilantes who took it upon themselves to sentence and execute Black bodies. Again, we wait for justice. These moments, incidents, tell us a great deal about being Black in America, both historically and presently. There's always violence associated with being Black, and often the way or ways in which we talk about being Black in America is coupled alongside anti-Black violence, both real and symbolic. But how do we remember Black life in the US? And in what ways do we carry forth the legacy of being Black? Moreover, how do we mark moments of anti-Black violence? The violent events that make up much of Black life in America have been remembered in any number of ways, including paintings, media, film, museums, and more presently in memorials. Shown to us are the acts of violence and the symbolic events that target a specific group of peoples marked as cultural others in spaces marked as white. We are seeing a growing number, however, of spaces being erected that unmarked white spaces instead commemorate bodies that had historically been violated. Rhetorical critiques of public memory have mostly focused on places, texts, and sites of memorialization that strategically remember the past for the purposes of symbolically narrating the present as Aiden, Dunn, and Hassan, Mitchell, and Rubriller have previously argued. We need to ask additionally, how does one keep the memory of the past alive when it has been actively forgotten through the conscious absence of memorialization of anti-Black violence, or what I would call violence by other means? Here we can think about how our participation in looking at, or our spectatorship in of memory or memorials can be and can lead to restorative justice for past acts of racial violence. So can one's own spectatorship in places that create memory become, through the act of memory mapping, the start of restorative justice? Using in part some of my own photographs later, I'll walk us through the National Memorial for Peace and Justice so that you can experience my thoughts while walking through the memorial, as well as my feelings. I will also spend some time discussing the Legacy Museum. My time in both was a somber experience. I chose to remember that for the visitors, our responses were emotional and that it was an impactful experience. Both the memorial and the Legacy Museum function as sites where we can remember racial violence. Hence, lynching and Black bodies are able to be recentered, and it is here where an act of justice might be located. In my memory, I want to believe that we were all changed by what we saw and heard. I felt it invoked a sense of empathy. But my other Byron creeps in and wonders, was it all empathy, or did I sense some apathy as well? This thought is what keeps bringing me back to grapple with how memory actively engages visitors to memorials. So Dickinson, Ott, and Elke argue that as official, quote, as official and institutionalized cultural expressions, public museums, memorials, and other historical sites play a crucial role in the construction and maintenance of national mythologies, histories, and identities. Andrea Burns has stated that museums, of course, have never functioned simply as repositories or dusty artifacts. Rather, she continues, African-American museums that emerged during the 1960s and 1970s challenged and recreated new national memories and identities that incorporated the ideas, events, objects, and places tied to Black history. In fact, as Burns further asserts, the Black Museum movement played an active role in the groundswell of the civil rights movement, Important to remember, this movement drew from the tradition of racial uplift exemplified by Du Bois's Talented Tenth, as well as the ideology of cultural Black nationalism promoted by the Black Power movement. Certainly museums and memorials are spaces that can function as what Kavanaugh refers to as a dreamscape. According to Kavanaugh, when we walk through our dreamscape, when we walk through or around a museum and its surrounding landscape, we weave both our bodies and our minds through these spaces, these dream spaces. Of the dreamscape, Dickinson tells us that the experience of a particular place comprises not just the tangible materials available in that place, but also the full range of memorized images that persons bring with them. Hence, it is possible that images we bring with us, those that are memorized, can be invisible images from spoken and unspoken memories of another person. As well, it is reasonable to believe, therefore, that memories have the power to make change. These moments of memory, both material and intangible, through which human visual experience becomes organized at a given moment, can enable us to think more about how to organize around the concept of restorative justice. As Owen and Ehrenhaus have mentioned, museums and memorials have the power to invoke memory. Moreover, they argue, reenactment confronts and explores the nation's memory, legacy of race lynching by recentering the body as a rhetorical resource. Museums and memorials, especially those that recount horrific moments of the past, can bring to public attention experiences of cultural trauma that remain unresolved. When we witness reenactment or when we walk through the memorial that brings to life in some way a tragic part of US history, that moment of the tragedy is recentered and, quote, reopens deep wounds. Per the EGI, lynchings were violent and public acts of torture that traumatized Black people throughout the country and were largely tolerated by state and federal officials. These lynchings were terrorism. To be sure, lynching is much more than a historical occurrence. In its reiterations, lynching remains a damaging part of our culture, of our public culture and persona. Ursula Orr explains how lynching becomes an expression of, as she suggests, American civic identity. She suggests lynching during the, quote, lynching during the American Revolution expressed ideals of popular sovereignty that framed the practice as the people's right to enforce a democratic ideal in lieu of those who posed a threat to the pursuit of American independence. Madison conceptualizes lynching as an act performed for spectators. He states, they knew their lines and stage movements. Crowds of angry citizens shout their outrage and epithets at the beginning of the spectacle. A knotted rope appears. The mob forcefully removes the victim from the jail. Some beat and mutilate him. Fire ignites to burn a dead body. The body remains hanging as a symbol. Souvenir hunters grab pieces of rope and clothing, and in some instances, even body parts. A photographer captures the scene of the victim, mob, and spectators. The play is ended, civilization is redeemed. To be a spectator, to restore or reinforce a democratic ideal, the act of lynching, as Sharp argues, rather than being surprising, acts more as an ongoing, recognizable, predictable, and constitutive aspect of this democracy. In other words, to recognize the history of lynching and other forms of anti-Black violent death as normative, it allows us to see ongoing state-sanctioned legal and extralegal murders of Black people as necessary for this so-called democracy. To be sure, there is to be sure the matter of dehumanization that might be a consequence of normalizing anti-Black violent death. The failure of the Black body to achieve humanity is, at its core, a consequence of spectatorship. The dehumanizing is a reminder that, as Iman Jackson reminds us, the Black body's fleshiness was aligned with that of animals and set in opposition to European spirit and mind, and that the Black body has been spectacularized. If the memorial can transform the reality of the Black body by reimagining the ways in which we understand the history of violence on Black bodies through our acts of remembering, memory, and memorializing, this opens up a space where we can and must imagine what citizenship could look like. Through this work, it may be possible then to locate acts of restoration or restorative justice. So several scholars have considered how memory works, specifically how memory is engaged and how audiences are both attended to and engaged through practices of commemoration, and how cultural memory practices address the democratization of the public culture. Haskins, in her book, argues that what matters is not who gets to participate, but how the participation expands the individual's sphere of caring to persuade citizens to embrace the various others, those for whom they have no natural affinity as fellow citizens. While Haskin recommends we consider how commemoration, in particular, stimulates encounters among strangers, Roger Aden suggests that a focus on audience ought to drive our studies on public memory. Through what he calls recollection, which recognizes that the work of remembering is done not simply through commemorative markers of some sort, but by the people who experiences those places of memory. Aden argues that this ultimately brings both shared and disparate experiences to memory sites as A, agents in helping craft a memory site, and B, visitors to both developing and completed spaces of commemoration. Importantly, Aden points out the importance in looking at the ways in which different groups of citizens deliberate about, agree on, and disagree on public memorials. Looking at memorials and memory in a different way through case studies, Teresa Demo and Bradford Vivian offer an examination of how the visual intersects with memory studies. Collectively, their case studies illustrate the importance of scrutinizing and grappling with the different forms of visual representations, and argue that memory sites can contribute to the preservations and or loss of memory in our collective transactions of memorials in any form, rather they have shared meaning, interpretations, or arguments. While these scholars theorize the rhetoric of public memory strategies in two distinct ways, the movement of individual memory to the collective realm and the control of common memories and narratives, we should also consider the ways in which memory and the memorial rely on public memory to restore justice. About public memory, Kendall Phillips suggests there is, in this sense, the rhetoric of public memory through which individuals articulate their own images of the past into a wider communal network. There are also rhetorics of public remembrance perpetuating cultural forms of memory and establishing frameworks for their official relation to the past. Ultimately, I want to consider the act of memory and memorializing as acts that can lead to some form of restoration. If we can think of the act of looking up at the memorial as a rhetorical act of repetition of memory, it is perhaps here we can theorize how repetition in memory or the memorial is an act of citizenship. Rhetorical critiques of public memory have focused on places, texts, and sites of memorialization that strategically remember the past to symbolically narrate the present. I want to turn our attention to the memorial now and how it uses different memory techniques to move us toward an act of restoration. Describing the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, John Allside, in his 2019 essay on Forbes, states that the site is built on a berm in Montgomery's historic Cottage Hill, Five Points neighborhood of slowly revitalizing blocks of Victorian and Queen Anne homes. The memorial is near a park named for the Wright brothers, and a popular mural is dedicated to the native son, Nat King Cole. Public interest lawyer MacArthur Fellow Brian Stevenson, who was the founder of the advocacy group, the EJI, is the brainchild behind the project and saw it come to its fruition in 2018. The 6-acre memorial includes the names of more than 4,400 African-American victims of lynchings that were perpetrated between 1877 and 1950 in hundreds of counties, over a dozen mostly southern states. At the centerpiece of the memorial is a group of 800 pillars that from a distance appear to be holding up a roof, Pantheon style. According to Stevenson, every piece has blemishes and streaks that will evolve in terms of color and complexion. The columns and slabs are made of cordon steel, a material that will rust indefinitely, leaving some monuments to lynching victims active. Once stepping inside the memorial, Fred Bernstein reminds us that the site now stands as a sobering reminder of racial inequality in America, from slavery to segregation to mass incarceration. Upon entrance, visitors are face to face with the steel sculptures. The names of the state and the county are in direct sight. Although there are numerous columns, the memorial functions as a singular entity. From its pristine gardens to its regaling hallways of names. On the design of the memorial site, it is conceived as a single immense installation for Hall and Cotter. The landscape site recalls the garden cemeteries of the 19th century America, which functioned as sculpture parks for mortuary art and meditative retreats. But the monument to the traumatic events of tragedy and violence attempt to tell the tragic story of lynching in America and relies on both the landscape of the memorial, but also the wording and sculptures included in the site. Bernstein states that, quote, as the scope of the project expanded, EGI consulted writers like Toni Morrison and enlisted artists like Hank Willis Thomas, who conceived a sculpture inspired by police violence, and Dana King, who created statues dedicated to the women who carried out the year-long Montgomery bus boycott. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice is dedicated to recovering and memorializing the victims of America's ugly history of lynching. I argue that the National Memorial invites citizens to turn the event of lynching into a political practice of restorative justice in the present by giving the victims of white supremacy a place for memorialization. In this way, the National Memorial offers a model for making the political practice of memory an act of resistance against the ambience of anti-Blackness, and thus makes Blackness hospitable to the culture that is actively seeing its erasure. But how does it accomplish this? In Toward Freedom, a reading of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, Margaret Pless offers a useful overview of the memorial. She suggests that the grounds are shaped like a clock. And as a visitor, you wind around a circular path that represents the time the memorial covers from the transatlantic slave through the present. Much of the description about the memorial describes it as a place that is in motion from its clock-like shape to its use of sculptures and layout. Over the next few minutes, I'd like to walk us through the memorial. In doing so, I hope to not only demonstrate through my own images the way the memorial stays in motion, but also how the design of the memorial actively moves and invites the visitor to consider why there has been no justice for the victims of racial violence. So in this section, I look at the landmark design of the memorial as it stands as a sobering reminder of that violence. So I'm going to start showing my images. So I'll apologize up front. These are pictures I took on my phone a few years ago. So they might not be the best images, but hopefully they do the job. Okay. So in the memorial, we are moved through the troubling past of lynching violence and the continued violence that comes with being Black in America. Approaching the grounds of the memorial, one looks up a gentle slope and views an immense structure immaculately designed to memorialize those who were the victims of white mob violence. Upon reaching the entrance of the memorial, you stop to read a history of the slave trade before walking up to one of the first statues on the ground of the artifact. The text tells visitors the story of the slave trade and its aftermath. To accompany the writing, visitors are next confronted by artist Kwame Okoto Bamfo's sculpture on slavery. We're confronted with an image that appears to be in movement. The movement of the bodies, along with their facial expressions, force the visitor, the viewer, the spectator, to experience the raw pain of being captured into slavery. The statue, along with the engraved story of the legacy, add to the somber nature of the memorial that overlooks the city that saw the birth of both the Confederacy and the Civil Rights Movement. The expressions on the faces of the characters are meant to express the pain of violence inscribed in their bodies. This pain is made more evident through the movement of their bodies as they relay postures of hunching, reaching, moving forward, and seemingly lifting off the ground. If you look carefully, the expressions on the faces of the bodies reveals the pain each one experiences, as well as the roots the figure represent. Pless says of this statue, we see bodies marked by lashes, yet not all of the markings on the body signify pain. One female figure's rounded belly displays a series of marks radiating out from her belly button. These could be tribal scars, tattoo-like etchings on the body. In some tribes, marks like this on the stomach indicate fertility. Reading the figure with this possibility in mind, Bamfo juxtaposes on these bodies the pain of captivity with the cultural roots and promises of reproduction. One must be made aware of the symbolism of the marker. The inclusion of the baby here is important as well. Bonfo's inclusion of the baby, also with a very expressive face that is in movement, carries on it pain and fear. The baby is a reminder of generational enslavement, from the babies captured into slavery to those born into slavery. It is also a reminder to the viewer that the generational continuity that contextualizes lynching and that symbolizes the reality of racial violence. After the statue, the visitor is asked to stop and read more about the journey to slavery. This text states in part, lynchings in America were not isolated hate crimes committed by rogue vigilantes. Lynchings were targeted racial violence perpetrated to uphold an unjust social order. Lynchings were terrorism. Perhaps more importantly, we read, white people who witnessed, participated in, and socialized their children in a culture that tolerated gruesome lynchings were also psychologically damaged. Some officials' tolerance of lynching created enduring national and institutional wounds that have yet healed. Lynchings occurred in communities where African Americans today remain marginalized, disproportionately poor, overrepresented in prisons and jails, and underrepresented in decision-making roles in the criminal justice system. This writing asks visitors to not only think about the legacy of slavery, but also how racial violence lynching in America has been allowed to continue its painful legacy. Moreover, it asks us to engage with this memory so that we may begin to reshape the cultural landscape that is rhetorically and visually reflected through the memorial's presentation of lynching and racial injustice. In the last sentence, the visitor is asked to contemplate the consequences of racial violence. Through the memory encapsulated vis-a-vis the design of the memorial, we are asked to participate in the act of justice. And then we enter the area where the columns rest. We are again asked to participate in the memory of racial violence in America. When walking up to the first set of columns, the visitor becomes a witness to lynching and racial violence as one sees the name of the county where the lynching was committed and the names of the victims where possible, and the date the lynching took place. The first row of columns as the visitor enters, rise from the floor. For some visitors, it may be the recognition of a name that causes one to pause. The first name on this column is Will McKinney, date of lynching 2/19/1886 in Carroll County, Mississippi. And while I can't be sure that this McKinney is a relative, it is my family's name on my family's side. This type of recognition might not mean anything to some visitors. Seeing names that are either recognizable because they are part of a visitor's family or because the visitor may know someone with that last name might move one to look deeper into the racial violence of America. As the visitor continues, the floor of the memorial begins to slope downward and the pendulums progressively hang higher, forcing the visitor to have to look up to read the information if one is so inclined. With more than 800 steel columns making up the memorial site, one can literally spend hours exploring the insidious nature of lynching in America. Interspersed throughout the memorial are some 90 lynching narratives. The terse narratives included in the memorial serve an important rhetorical purpose, as I will discuss later, to moving visitors toward embracing the concept of restorative justice. While these narratives are troubling, they invite the visitor to do two things. First, actively become more aware of the types of accusations Black Americans were violently murdered for. And second, to empathize with the fear Black people lived with every day. Additionally, the short narratives allow the visitor to become a part of the larger public communal memory of lynching, a memory that is mapped in the memorial and that the visitor, while not their own personal memory, can become witness to. This inscription, located near the end of the third corridor and authored by the EJI, is a powerful reminder of anti-Black violence. To be sure, the second to the last line of the large inscription authored by the EJI, which says, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, unapologetically demands we always work toward justice for those who were the victims of racial and mob violence. The visitor still in motion through the memorial is asked to consider what justice should look like for victims of racial violence and their descendants, and that the need for justice is ongoing as racial violence continues at the moment the visitor reads the inscription. So the concept of restorative justice converges in the space that blends the actual memorial as a space for public memory in the Social Justice Center. Both the National Memorial for Justice and the Legacy Museum work together to act as a space for memory, reflection, grieving, and learning about the connection between the historical legacy of lynching and the ongoing systemic violence through the state's treatment of Black bodies through mass incarceration and violent policing. While Brian Stevenson and others from the Equal Justice Initiative began placing markers at lynching sites in Montgomery, the idea was to speak out about victimization and the significant impact this could have on survivors of genocide and mass violence, et cetera, following in the thoughts of scholars who have studied the impact of human rights violations and abuses. To this day, EJI visits locations of lynching, collects soil, places it in a mason-like jar, and gives it a home at the museum. In fact, in 2019, the EJI visited my hometown of Sandusky, Ohio, to collect the soil where lynching occurred and to note where a marker would be placed to memorialize the victim. William Taylor, who was lynched in 1878, of William Taylor, who was lynched in 1878. Now, growing up, we never knew about this lynching in our hometown. It was never taught, no one ever talked about it. According to an article in the Sandusky Register, the event known as the Sandusky Soil Collection Community Project hoped to strengthen its legacy in hopes of, going forward, better educating community members. This is directly from my hometown paper, the Sandusky Register. Better educating community members to end racial clashes and senseless violence. That was the direction to people of Sandusky. It is not clear what violence or racial classes this article is referring to, hence this type of response feels inadequate and somewhat dangerous. Thus, I wish to briefly discuss the Legacy Museum as it is also an important part of this move toward justice, restorative justice, and is at the space where I wish to conclude my talk. The Legacy Museum is the space where, through its interactive exhibits, the call for restorative justice continues. I would suggest it is best to visit after the memorial. Per the EJI website, the museum opened to the public on April 26, 2018. The 11,000 square foot museum is built on the site of a former warehouse where enslaved Black people were imprisoned and is located midway between an historic slave market and the main river dock and train station where tens of thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the height of the domestic slave trade. Montgomery's proximity to the fertile Black Belt region, where slave owners amassed large enslaved populations to work the rich soil, elevated Montgomery's prominence in domestic trafficking. And by 1860, Montgomery was the capital of the domestic slave trade in Alabama, one of the two largest slave-owning states in America. At the museum, much like the memorial, visitors again encounter the consequences of violent acts of racism. In the museum, the glass jars hold the soil from lynching sites. As well, there are numerous exhibits that include maps, rarely seen first-person accounts of the domestic slave trade, EJI research material, and information on lynching and segregation, all adding to the feel of the museum and following in the tradition of the Black Museum tradition. Finally, visitors also encounter, using videography and interviews, extensive content about the racial terrorism of lynching, the humiliation of Jim Crow South, and the nation's ever-growing problems with mass incarceration and injustice in the court system. Importantly, the exhibits offer those visiting an opportunity to, per the museum site, investigate America's history of racial injustice and its legacy, drawing dynamic connections across generations of Americans impacted by the narrative of racial difference. So some have characterized the idea of restorative justice as being unfair and discriminatory, and according to Derringer, have complained that the seeming unfairness that as males, whites, and Christians, they are the only group that does not have the right to celebrate its specificity. These groups therefore ask why they cannot hold things such as straight pride as a possible counteract to acts of restorative justice. Members of these groups' powerful publics are able to recast movements towards restorative justice as unfair or discriminatory only insofar as they are able to historicize the status quo, proffer classical liberalism, appropriate the rhetoric of marginalized groups. These rhetorics of persuasion operate to preserve privilege for the invisible center. I want to suggest here, following Derringer, that one possible strategy to combating this rhetoric of majority persecution may be better understood by locating the often invisible systems of privilege that function to position some people as normal and unremarkable, while marking others as different or as deficient. Through an analysis of the way the memorial and the museum actively engage our memory to move us to engaging with acts of justice, I believe we can locate strategies that engage us to better understand what citizenship can be and how systems of privilege are destructive. Put a different way, we need to consider the ways in which the memorial and museum persuades the visitor that there is a need to enact restorative justice in a moment where there continues to be injustice and racial violence. The concept of restorative justice then serves as a place of convergence that blends the actual memorial as a space for public memory and the social justice center as a companion space. Both of these work together to formalize a space for memory, reflection, grieving, and ultimately learning about the connection between the historical legacy of lynching and ongoing systemic violence through the state's treatment of Black bodies through mass incarceration and violent policing. And just really quickly, through its creative use of videography, the museum engages the voices of inmates who were unjustly sentenced to imprisonment to tell their stories, to invoke an emotional response from its visitors. The video performances, while not enactment that is practiced and recirculated, vis-a-vis uniquely fostering embodied experience as a way of knowing, producing knowledge that is anchored in practice and circulated within a performance community, they are replayed throughout the day, inviting visitors to relive those experiences. And as Owen and Aaron House have argued, reenactment invites those participants to experience the past viscerally through the liminal space that performance opens, and consequently to participate in the effective construction of traumatic memory. In these stories, the viewer is made aware that not only of the injustices done to these men, but also the trauma that has become a part of their lives because of practices in incarceration. So while what happens at the Legacy Museum is not necessarily reenactment, hearing those voices elicits a strong visceral response. And I think I'm going to stop because I'm a little out of time, but in the end, really what I'm doing here is thinking about how, if we bring these two things together collectively, and as we think about moving through that memorial and through the museum, I think it leaves us with the question of, can these spaces restore justice? Are they going to be a practice of redemption? But I'm mostly concerned, can they make us start thinking about why restorative justice or why justice is absolutely necessary? So I'm going to stop there because I want to have time for questions and some comments. So sorry about that. I thought I had this down to like 40 minutes, but I went over. So sorry about that, Dr. Reed.
Thank you, Dr. Craig, and no apologies necessary. Part of the problem was my own sound issue, so I cost you a few minutes. So I'm comfortable, if you are, with going about half an hour for Q&A, if that works for you. I think that works on our end. So for those of you who don't know, and I should probably have said this from the start, I'm Dr. Reed of the History Department at Illinois State University. I'm a professor of African American history and 20th century US history, and I'm co-director of African American Studies. And my fellow co-director is Dr. Brea Banks, who is with us, who is an assistant professor of psychology. And I think it's probably useful for you to know who we are, in part because we are moderating this exchange. Dr. Craig, one thing that occurs to me is that since you are the fourth recipient of this grant, that 50% of our recipients are named Craig. So if you are a faculty member who is interested in applying for this grant, your odds are much higher. Your odds of success are much higher if your last name is Craig. Just keep that in mind as we move forward. But
My
having
cousin
said
had last year.
there, exactly. So, or the year before, I think it's the year before.
Yeah,
But
before.
so I've got a not fully formed question about restorative justice for you, if you'll indulge, and that's this. I very much appreciate your stroll through the history of lynching and violence, and as you said, lynching I think is reasonably understood as a form of terrorism. And I think it's also reasonably understood as a form of state violence. But keeping it in the parameters of state violence, I'm curious about your thoughts about the links between lynching, because it seems to be implied by way of the narrative of restorative justice, and police violence.
Mhm.
And what I'm curious about, I guess, would come down to this. If you were to go through the ledger of lynching victims from the late 19th century through the mid 20th century, the vast majority of them were Black. It's not just that Blacks were overrepresented among lynching victims. The vast majority of the victims of lynching were Black, and of course, Black men in particular. In more recent years, in the last, let's just keep it this decade, Black Americans are certainly overrepresented among the victims of police violence, but they're not the majority. And in every year that we have statistics for, again, for the last decade or more, whites constitute a plurality, if not a majority, of the number of people who are murdered by police. Usually around 50% of the victims of police violence, the people who are murdered by police, I should say, are white. Blacks are usually about 30%, roughly between 25 and 30%, roughly. And interestingly enough, if you were to go down to the level of the states, the disparities are actually much more pronounced in the Northeast, let's say, than they are in the South. And in fact, in some of the southern states like Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, at least in 2016, Blacks were actually underrepresented among people who were murdered by police, which, if you know anything about the history, as I know you do, of Georgia and South Carolina in particular, that's kind of surprising in the abstract. So, and in many other states, I think like Kentucky, there's not really much of a disparity. That the murder rates are about equal to the share of Blacks and whites share of the total population. But again, I want to stress that the disparities are actually greater in the Northeast in aggregate than they are in the former slave states, interestingly enough. And I believe the same is true for incarceration. That said, and in fact, I know that that's true for incarceration in a state like Texas. Texas has, I think, among whites, if Texas were a country and you were just to simply focus on whites, I think Texas would be one of the world's leaders of the incarceration if you only focused on white people. So having said that, my question about restorative justice then is this, and again, as I said, it is not a fully formed question. The suffering and trauma that Blacks have experienced over the last century is undeniable, but the notion of restorative justice may imply a commonality across time that I wonder if that is borne out exactly if you look at the statistics. Are the mechanisms the same, let's say, in your view, that informed lynching, in between 1880 and 1940 versus police violence today, or the murder of Black Americans at the hands of police officers today, or even mass incarceration? Does that seem like a reasonable question?
Yeah. Well, it's one that I'll have to think through, but I will say one thing. Though, is that I think one of the things I'm really concerned with is a historical reckoning also. Well, while those numbers, as you suggested, are different, right? When we think about policing and violent policing in particular, in the US and the number of people that have been killed by the police, certainly, those statistics ring true. However, I think what I'm really concerned about is, if there is this connection with lynching and anti-Black violence historically, we still have not reckoned with that. We still have not brought justice about with that, I think. And I think that's what I'm concerned with, and specifically when we think about these sites of memory, right? What role can they play in making us think not only about the connection between modern day policing on Black bodies specifically, but that of lynching also, right? And so what kind of justice do we need to seek from that? And honestly, I think when we think about it, that type of justice that I'm talking about shouldn't just be applied to Black folk currently, right? Maybe that's when if we can start thinking about these sites of where we see racial injustice, where they display racial injustice, right? Or memorialize racial injustice. Will those eventually become places that we can study to think about policing overall in this country, right? And the maybe the over violence of policing in this country, right? And not to get into a discussion about policing, because I don't want to, I mean, we can go there, but I think that this then serves as a way of thinking about not only that violence on Black bodies, but state violence in particular, right? But I think what we have to start with that is to think about this kind of the racialized violence on Black folks during slavery and after slavery. So for me, I see it all as a connection, as a way eventually to think about, how do we work through this problem? How can we better look at state-sanctioned violence overall for everyone, whoever it affects, right? Black bodies, white bodies, brown bodies. And we can't forget poor folk as well, right? Who, suffer and we don't talk about enough, also who have been, faced violence.
Well, thank you. And I hear what you're saying and appreciate it. And I have to say that since we both spent time in Atlanta at the same time, actually, or at least overlapping time there, that, and I don't know if you would agree with this, but on the one hand, I'm very happy to see those horrible museums to people who led a treasonous insurrection in defense of the undemocratic institution known as slavery taken down.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, in keeping with your point about restorative justice, my dream is not that they would be destroyed, oddly enough, but I would like to see them in a museum of Jim Crow that would educate people about not the myth of the lost cause, which is what those monuments actually commemorated, which isn't history, but would rather educate people about the actual history of those monuments as symbolic buttresses to Jim Crow regimes, and of course, educate Americans about what Jim Crow was. So I very much appreciate your answer to my rambling question. So thank you for your generosity and indulgence. Even as I got the ball rolling, that's kind of my job. Our end game here is to open up to everyone. So please, if you have questions, make yourself known. And since you're spread over 3 screens, we won't be able to see you all necessarily. So if we don't see you, and we do see Shauna Carlson, so who will be our next, I think, person to ask a question, put your questions in the chat in a worst case scenario.
Yeah. Hey, Shana.
Hi, Dr. Craig. I really, really enjoyed what you had to say. In terms of kind of broadening your area of research in memory specifically, I have two questions. I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget them. So the first is, have you looked into exploring the collective memory and how hegemons utilize memorials in a way to spin history to benefit the hegemon and downplay the hegemon's participation in the violence? And then conversely, how the subaltern or the other utilizes their collective memory through the memorial to combat the hegemon's collective memory and to drive or demand or create that push for restorative justice?
Sure. I mean, those are two good points, two good questions that I am just now beginning to look into. That I think will certainly add to the work that I want to do. But I think also it really adds to this notion. So in December, I'm going to New York to do some research at the New York Public Library. And one of the reasons I'm doing that, one of the reasons we're doing that is because we want to look at how memory is forgotten, right? So for instance, on Wall Street, Wall Street's glamorized, right? But there's a real problem with Wall Street, right? In that, that was a big slave market also, right? And so how do we, how do we forget that memory is forgotten, right? And I'll be honest, I didn't know that either. I knew other things about New York, but it's not something that I knew. And so, there's a collective memory of Wall Street, right? But there's also this other memory of Wall Street that we don't remember, right? That's disremembered, and for reasons, of course, that are obvious. Doesn't want to be associated with the slave trade, with the slave market. So I think that's a good point to get into, and is one that we'll look into while we're there. And the wonderful thing about it is that documents exist that we can look at, right? And that's hence why we're going to New York. I love New York. I'll go to New York for any reason, but to see those documents and to see those spaces also. So another part, it's important for me, and this is just kind of me personally, seeing images and taking those photographs for me kind of invoke a memory that's not necessarily mine, but I can look at those and think about those people who lived through that trauma, right? Who lived through those moments of racial violence, any other kind of violence, right? So I think I like what you're saying, and thank you for those. I'll use those as suggestions rather than a question. So thank you.
Not a problem. And just as a heads up, I have been obsessed with researching the collective memories since undergrad. So if you are looking for anything to get you started, I do have some sources I can shoot your way. So
Cool.
just let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions for Dr. Craig?
I'm going through this and looking also and seeing.
Don't be shy, you're among friends. Oh, Tony Grubach.
Thanks, Dr. Craig, for the excellent talk. I don't know if my question is directed at you. It's somewhat unfair because it's going to maybe ask you to go outside of your field and talk. Maybe it's more for Dr. Reed, but his mention of a museum and your discussion of Brian Stevenson, who said he learned a lot from the Germans, right? In creating the lynching memorial. Makes me think of Susan Neiman's fairly recent Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil. And her argument basically is that Germans seem to have done a much better job of confronting the demons of their history and the racist and violent past. I guess I wondered if you had any thoughts on that subject, not being an expert on Germany, but maybe more reflections on what are the, besides the things you've mentioned today in your talk, the main obstacles to us, confronting our past, to having those museums that Dr. Reed wishes for.
So, I think that's a good question. I'll try to answer as best I can. But I kind of specifically like the whole notion of the obstacles, right? What are those obstacles? And I think, part of that is, and I think we're seeing this more and more now in the United States. It's kind of interesting. This wanting to, like I said earlier, this disremembering, our past. And I think some of that, and I'm probably kind of going off base with what your question is actually, because as you were talking, I started thinking, yeah, we just remember things. And I do that. Sometimes I start talking to myself. So if I get off track here, just stop me. This disremembering and that I think comes from this kind of level of shame. And so when we think about Germany, so one of my best friends when I was at Wright State in Dayton, Ohio, her father was, her mother was German and her father was white American who went over during the war, and they met and they got married. But I used to talk to her mother and her grandmother had these interesting stories about in Germany, how they didn't, they couldn't talk about the Holocaust for such a long time at that age. They just wanted to forget it. They didn't want it talked about. They didn't want it talked about in schools. But at home, they did talk about it, right? Because her grandfather actually was trying to help some Jewish folk escape and was shot in the leg by Nazis. And, but they never talked about it publicly, which I always found really interesting. And so where we are now, here in the United States, I think about that same thing. And the one thing that she said to me that her grandfather told her was that he felt people were ashamed, right? And maybe that's not true, but I think it offers us a good place to start thinking, if I'm so concerned, and I am concerned about this notion of empathy, is it something that's a moment of shame that makes people not want to deal with the past, right? And maybe I'm being kind here. I like to try to be kind as much as I can, but I wonder, is it this notion of shame, of someone feeling ashamed, where they don't, Tony, I'll be honest with you, I think I'm getting away from what your question actually was. So kind of pull me back in here.
No, keep going, because my question was vague and off your field. So keep going, please.
Yeah, and so it's this grappling with, what is the thing? What is it that makes us not want to, deal with the past and to dredge up a history that we know for a fact happened, right? So it's always interesting to think about, what are the things that maybe we don't consider as the reasons why people don't want to remember, right? Or don't want to deal with our memory, or to deal with these memorials. And I don't think that answers the question of, why people get upset about taking certain statues and memorials down. I haven't figured that one out yet, but I do think there is something to do with this notion of shame. And, shame is not necessarily just this innocent thing, right? It's also, this, shame can also be this ideal of, I'm not going to show my shame. I'm kind of trying to work through this. I don't necessarily want to show this shame, but I know this past. But if I show my shame, then I'm showing a weakness, right? So I don't know. I've got to work through that some more. Who was? Go ahead, Tom.
I'll just say real quick, this is just such an interesting conversation to me, right? The psychologist enters the chat, relevant to shame and whatnot. I think what you were sort of saying there at your last bit, Dr. Craig, right? Like, I think people sometimes are shameful. And I think that sometimes when you have to own up to shame, there's accountability, right? And so I think, I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic surrounding like why folks struggle with, owning up to our past and like remembering things the way that they actually happen. But sometimes there's an accountability piece that comes in there. When you own up to it and when you remember it the way that it was, then when you actively choose not to maybe take the action that's like moral or right, then there are like implications as a result of that. So I appreciated Tony's question, because I think it got you thinking about some ideas that are really important.
Yeah. And, and I think with that also comes into that accountability comes there, if we're talking about, reparations of any sort, right? If you become accountable, then, you can't, it becomes more difficult to argue to not have reparations, right? And that's a whole different subject, a whole different conversation, but yeah.
Well, and it's also worth noting that the Nazi Party was destroyed after World War II. So
Yeah.
with the elimination of the Nazis, you have cleared the slate, so to speak, to re-educate the devastated German population. And obviously the conservative Democrats who had been complicit, who had led the treasonous insurrection against the United States of America in defense of the undemocratic institution of slavery, they were still around, right? And part of that story is that the Republican Party, the Republican Party's anti-slavery coalition included business, and everyone and their mother understood that slavery was a form of labor, and that plantation owners were engaged in the pursuit of wealth on some level. And so dismantling slaveholders' plantations, let's say, which radical Republicans had proposed, and redistributing them to the slaves, which I think would have not only been the right thing to do and the just thing to do, but frankly, as one born in North Carolina and grew up between Atlanta, Georgia, and New Orleans, Louisiana, through the age of 13 anyway, the South would have been better off for it as a whole, and American politics would have been better off for it as a whole had that been done. But the fact of the matter is that was off the table, right? For reasons I have, waved at anyway. And if that's off the table, then the potential to educate folks in the South, on a level similar to what happened in Nazi Germany, in post-Nazi Germany, as opposed to Austria, which did not follow that path, as I understand it, interestingly enough. But anyway, that's just not an option, right? So that's a big part of the story.
So I think Melissa had a question.
Well, just kind of along those lines, I was going to ask about, I imagine some of these images are very difficult for people to see. And so just curious about where you draw your strength to be a witness to these very powerful images, and what, advice maybe you have to people who might say, I don't need to look at that. And just wondering about your perspective on that.
Well, that's a good question, Melissa. For me, in one of the earlier versions of my work, I talked about my, my mother being from Troy, Alabama. And so spending a lot of summers in Alabama with my grandparents, really every summer. And even after I got older, when I lived in Atlanta as an adult, I still went down to Alabama during the summers, right? And so my very first memory of being in Alabama, and this connects to your question, my very first memory as a child was walking with my grandfather downtown in Troy, and a white woman coming towards us, and my grandfather telling us to step off of my twin brother and I to step off the sidewalk to let her pass. Well, I grew up in Sandusky, Ohio, right? Where, as I mentioned earlier, there actually was a lynching, we just never knew about it. And I just remember thinking from that moment, wow, this is crazy. I have to step off the sidewalk for a person who is just a person, right? And so for me, I imagined the life of my grandfather, the life of my mother and her brother living in Alabama. And so for me, I have to look at those images to understand maybe the kind of fear that they lived through and that people who look like them lived through. And so for me, it's I really don't feel like I have a choice not to look at them and not to look at those images. But because for me, it is bearing witness to my ancestors, and acknowledging my ancestors' pain, acknowledging the fact that there may have been people in my family who suffered that type of racial violence. And so I have to see it, I have to look at it. But I think for people who maybe are on the fence with it, and then again, I think maybe my psychology friends can jump in here, Dr. Banks and Dr. Jordan. I think, what I would advise is that I think to really unconditionally understand the fabric of this country, and to to be fair to everyone in this country who may not look like people who don't look like me. I think you owe it. I'm going to say something kind of mean here. I think you owe it to my ancestors to look at it and to see it and to understand the theater of lynching, and not just to see it, but to also understand, as I talked about earlier, the whole performance of it, right? That it wasn't just that moment of lynching, but it was the moment of, before lynching, being dragged to that post. Which is why I love that Stevenson's, that the museum, the memorial and the museum do this, go to those towns and gather up the soil where the body was dragged, right? That's what happened in Sandusky. But then to take that dirt and to place it there in the museum, but then to also understand that after the act of lynching, the body could be dismembered, right? Or burnt, and people came for souvenirs, right? I think for me, it makes us more aware of the possibilities of a nation, right? Not just the past of a nation, but the possibilities of what a nation could do again that we hope won't happen, right? And so I think, being aware of what that looks like and putting yourself in that position of the pain that person experienced or those people experienced, I think has the ability to possibly maybe save us from an ugly past, right? And so that's what I would say to keep in mind, to maybe think about, looking at those images and, remembering that those images circulated, right? They circulated like postcards around the country, right? People would take pictures and then send them to relatives. Here's what we did, right? So, I think for me, it's a matter of honoring my ancestors. But I think for people who have a problem with looking at it, and it's up to, basically it's their decision in the long run, right? I can't force someone to look at them, know what I want to, but I think that there's a consequence of not. I think there's a consequence that might come from not looking at it and not acknowledging and not being a witness to it, although it's not your own memory. I think I wanted to be a part of my memory. I think that's a nice way of saying, everyone look at them.
We have two more questions and not a lot of time left, but I will say before I turn the virtual mic over to Dr. Scott Jordan and then Ross Smith, that one of my favorite things about Dr. Craig is the seriousness with which he responds to, he brings to his responses to questions. And he has always impressed upon me, or he instantly impressed me as one who takes very seriously the questions that are put to him. And thank you for that.
Yeah.
Dr. Scott Jordan from the psychology department.
Psychology on deck.
Thank you very much. You can see I'm in my car listening to this fantastic talk. I'm very excited about where this conversation is headed. Your last comments, Dr. Craig, about not wanting this to happen again. This is precisely why the federal government in Germany in the 60s forced the Holocaust to be part of their educational system. It wasn't a vote. It wasn't a bottom-up process. It was forced by the federal government. There's a fantastic book called On the History of Natural Destruction, A Natural History of Destruction, written by a scholar named Sebald, about the lengths that the German population went to post-World War II to forget what had happened in the name of rebuilding their present. And that was how they kept themselves occupied with disremembering, as you said. I think what I really appreciate about this conversation is it allows us to frame where we are now in this culture when we look at school board arguments about critical race theory, right? In other words, I guarantee you this kind of resistance happened in post-World War II Germany as well. And it wasn't until the federal government enforced it upon the state governments in Germany, at least, that the possibility of this actually becoming part of the collective consciousness of contemporary Germans came to the fore. And if you ever have the opportunity to speak to Germans of different generations, this is part of all of their collective conscience, different ways. So I more of a comment than a question, but I just love the fact that we're having this conversation.
Thanks, Dr. Jordan.
And
So-
our last question from Roth Smith.
Dr. Smith.
Hi, Dr. Craig. So I really like the way you talk about looking up inside this monument. I think it's a genius design element that I believe you said the floor slopes away. So I had a question on that, and then just a broader question about public memory and rhetoric, because I'm not in this area at all, but you had mentioned they rust, the things that are the big columns, they rust. Is that a design element so that 50, 100, 200 years, it's going to be a different experience? And then that kind of prompted me thinking, in public memory, in rhetoric, do people explore the interactive nature or tactile dimensions of public memory as much, or is it more, I'm thinking of like the Vietnam War Memorial where it's minimally impactful and you go through? Is that an element to it that would, I guess, intersect with restorative justice and memory?
Sure. So I'll answer both questions at the same time. So I think part of the reason why the EGI designed it the way they did. So I took you inside of the memorial, right? Outside of the memorial, I don't know if you haven't been to the memorial. Outside of it are slabs with the same names, the dates and all that sit outside of the memorial also. And those are meant for places to come and claim and take back to their counties or their cities or wherever to memorialize those people, right? And the last I heard, no one had claimed any still, right? But I think it goes along with this notion of how we think about public memory as a form of rhetoric, right? So is public memory meant to, how do I say this? Is it meant to, if we think about public memory, for me, I'm thinking about how do we use it to persuade a larger audience that, or to get a larger audience involved in this work of justice, right? And so I think any of these memorials, I think certainly we can just walk through them and not really engage with them. I think that's a possibility. But I think if it's designed in a way where, and the reason I call this looking up, right, is that, we get to a point where we actually have to look up at that. And that reenactment is sort of, I'll say this, when we were going through with somebody that I was with when I went through it, they said, this is making my neck hurt looking up, right? And they didn't really realize what they were saying. I was like, well, it's kind of the point, is for us to have to look up at this and become a part, right, of that memory of that event, right? And so I think it does the work of really putting us in that moment with the actual victims of lynching, right? And so I think then what it does, it really grows this notion of public memory, right? And what public memory can be if we're actually forced to physically be a part of this thing that happened in the past, right? And so then we, in a way, I think become, we engage with memory in a way that maybe we hadn't engaged with memory, although it's not our own memory, right? Because I've never been lynched in that way, but I become a witness and I remember it through, I was able to think about memory with it and remembering and memorializing it because I had that action, right? And I think that's the thing and this is something I didn't really get to talk about. That museum is you're in constant motion in that museum, right? Through the statues, through the way the pendulums are placed, through the statues that exist after you go through the museum, that, make us think about the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And also where it's placed, that it's placed within in this city that, was a #1 area of the marketing of slavery, right? So I think memory just is all around that museum, and that memorial in both of those places. So I don't know if I answered your question, but thank you. Thank you, Raw. Anyone else? Oh, you said that was the last question. It was a good
That's
conversation.
our last one.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, can I say?
No, I defer to you. Yes.
Yeah, but I really appreciate everyone being here, and I appreciate the questions. I did want to say that if anyone has any thoughts or any other kind of questions, this is ongoing research. Please feel free to email me at bbcraig@ilstu.edu, because I'd like to hear your feedback. Again, like I said, this is some ongoing research I'm interested in, and I am going to be, now that I've had my booster and my flu shot, I'm going to travel more and start getting more images and looking at these documents and really putting myself in these spaces so I can, I'm very much about feeling. And so I like to feel how these spaces felt and kind of reimagine what those spaces felt like for people who were in these situations. And it was for me to go to Peru, Illinois for the march was important because I spent a lot of time actually on the river, because I wanted to feel how that river felt and how it must have felt, right? And not just for Jelani Day, but for numerous other victims we can think about in areas where lynching occurred, right? How did that moment feel? What was it like for them? So I just get really into the feelings of anyone who's had any kind of injustice done to them. And I think that's important. And I think that's a way where we can work more towards empathy as well as a nation. So. But I'll be quiet. But thank you all for being. I really appreciate it. I didn't expect this many people to be here, so I feel really good about that. And it was really nice to talk through this with you all.
Well, again, thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful day.